Hey, we're in a series right now that is just, who is my neighbor? And how do I love them? I got this Facebook message last night, and because of what Derek just led us in, I think this is very appropriate. The sun will come up in Kabul and all over Afghanistan around 11 p.m. tonight, Eastern Standard Time, that is. It will be Sunday morning there, because they're 8.5 hours ahead of us. There will be thousands of Afghani Christians in church. They will be there regardless of the events that have transpired since they gathered last week for worship. That's crazy, you say. The Taliban's taken over their city, and they'll kill them. They know that. They've known that their entire lives. They've never known anything different. This Sunday will be no different than any other Sunday in the last centuries in Afghanistan. And yet the church in Afghanistan is growing faster than any other country except Iran. Pastors there have been informed that by the Taliban that they are targets and they are coming to get them. The pastors and the Christians have said that they know that, but they're not going anywhere. Does anyone see the positive correlation between courage and growth when it comes to Christianity? What would American pastors and American Christians do when faced with the same situation? Do you think maybe the population of Afghanistan has seen the persecution of Christians before? They've seen what the Taliban has done in the past, and yet they will observe the faithfulness of Christians in spite of it. Do you think they see their courage and want to find out who this Jesus is that's worth losing everything for, including their lives? Well, tonight at 11 p.m. our time, churches will begin meeting on the Afghani, Sunday morning. We will probably hear a mixture of gunfire and church music over Kabul as the Taliban fighters raid churches and kill those there. Is that not a sobering and yet a very humbling thought? What would you do if somebody walked in here right now with their uniform on, with their gun, and they just opened fire? That's what they live with every day. And so with that going on over there, I just find it real appropriate today that our message is loving my enemies, forgiving my enemies. See, in this series of Who's My Neighbor, we've been looking at the example that Jesus demonstrated for us and the various neighbors he had when he was walking here on this earth. And today we're going to see how Jesus loved and had compassion for a Roman centurion when his servant was at death's door. He also showed compassion to a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was demon-possessed. When the religious leaders complained that Jesus spent time with the likes of a guy named Matthew and Zacchaeus because they were the enemies of Israel. And Jesus called out to them and he showed them love and acceptance. You see, when we're talking about loving our neighbors and demonstrating that love to our neighbors, it may begin by forgiving our enemies. Because right now, we live in a world, do we not, that just demands justice and vengeance when we're wronged, no matter what. Think about the popular action-adventure movies that are out there. They're filled with characters who take justice into their own hands, right? They hunt down the evil men and women who destroyed their lives. How many of you have heard of the Jason Bourne movies? Yeah, you heard of those? How about the Jack Reacher movies? Similar, very similar. Well, the most recent one that I have not seen the movie, but I know about is John Wick. There's 3 of those movies as well. And the title character, he mercilessly hunts down the men who broke into his home. They robbed him, and they left him for dead. Sounds like a parable that we talked about, doesn't it? Called the Good Samaritan. But the movie, listen, this movie and the idea of vengeance is so popular in our country that they were able to make 2 more movies after the first one. And those 2 other movies were more violent and they were more bloody than the first. And it's all because the world around us has the mindset, get revenge. Get revenge. But it's not the behavior that we're called to as Christians. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told his followers this in Luke chapter 6. He said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian here in the 20th century, he wrote this. By our enemies, Jesus means those who are quite intractable and utterly unresponsive to our love, who forgive us nothing when we forgive them all, who requite our love and with hatred and our service with derision. Because if we pray for them, we're taking their distress, their poverty, their guilt, their perdition upon ourselves and pleading to God for them. What we are doing is we're doing vicariously for them what they cannot do for themselves. When Jesus walked this earth, Israel was occupied by the Roman Empire. And can I just say, the Romans were not known for mercy. Especially with the people they just conquered. They weren't going to be merciful to them. Their leaders weren't quick to forgive any form of even a little rebellion against the Roman Empire. So at this time, listen, Rome is considered the enemy of Israel. And later, if you read through history, what you find is that there were several emperors that murdered countless Christians, countless early believers, just because they were believers. And think about this. Knowing all of this, Jesus still showed love and compassion to a Roman centurion when his servant, who was most likely part of his family, he was at death's door. He showed compassion to a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was demon-possessed. 2 people that should be hated by the Jews, Jesus did not hate. He recognized the needs. He was caring for people who were considered by many to be the enemies of the Jews. And what he's demonstrating to you and me is that we need to be compassionate to individuals' needs and to the plights of people from other countries. Governments probably considered enemies of our country. Let me just bring it a little closer home. When you think about Jesus, how about the tax collector? Nobody liked the tax collector. Not even today. What kind of feelings do you get when I use the letters IRS? I bet you're not overwhelmed with joy, are you? No, we still don't like them. But during the time of Jesus, these tax collectors were Jews, but they were seen as traitors to their own people. You see, not only did they work directly for the Roman government, but the way they made their money was they cheated their fellow man. They cheated the fellow Jews. That's how they made their money. They overcharged at every opportunity to put coin in their pocket. And so when the religious leaders complained that Jesus spent time with the likes of Matthew, a tax collector, Zacchaeus, a tax collector, because they were the enemy of the people that were in Israel at the time, what did he do? He still called out. He still called to them. And he showed them love and compassion and acceptance that they had not experienced, I'm guessing, in years. And that love drastically changed them. When we show love to those who cheat us, who hurt us, what we do is we give space for God to use His transforming power. But every time we take justice in our own hands, we open the door to more violence, more bloodshed. But when we show mercy, we break the cycle, and the violence stops with us. I don't know how many of you saw a story, it's been out on the web, about a lady in Denver, Colorado. This happened about 7 years ago. The story is coming out again over and over. But it's this lady in Denver, and her toddler was out playing in front of the house, and there was a drive-by shooting. And the toddler was killed. And it's a great video, and in that video interview, the mother says, listen to this, she had heard a voice the night that her son was killed, telling her to forgive the young man that was responsible. Oh. And she did. This guy is in prison. He was caught. He was put in prison. He's in prison for life. He reached out for help, not only to people around him, he reached out to help for the mother of the kid that he shot. Can I just say that took guts? But yet she reached back to him. She reached back and had conversation. She went to visit him. And this is what is so cool, because the story of the woman who chose to forgive. But she not only forgave the man that killed her son, she adopted him. I don't know that I could do that. But that's what Jesus has called us to do. To love our enemies and forgive those. So with what she has done, 2 lives have been restored. 2 lives. And because of that story, we're hearing all over that there are more and more lives being transformed because they understand they have the ability to do what she did. What a testimony for God's forgiveness. You see, we got to understand, forgiving our enemies, loving our neighbors, it's not just about them. Okay? I know you hear me say a lot, it's not about me, okay? You hear that a lot. We don't forgive them because it's about me. But I will say, we will be blessed when we forgive. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, again, I want you to understand who he was. I want you to understand what it meant to love your neighbor, who also was your enemy. Because that's what he experienced. He was a pastor. He was living in Germany during World War II. And Bonhoeffer was a part of the underground movement who was working against Hitler's regime. And when he was ultimately arrested, he was placed in a prison camp for crimes against the Third Reich. But he continued to preach. Even in prison, he was preaching to anyone who would listen, the prisoners and the guards alike. And he preached up to the moment of his execution. And here's the interesting thing to that story. His execution came one day before the end of the war. But he didn't stop. He did a study of the Sermon on the Mount. Most of it was written during his time in prison. And he wrote this: in the face of the cross, the disciples realized that they too were Jesus' enemies. That he had overcome them by his love. It is this that opens the disciples' eyes and enables him to see the enemy as a brother. Listen, when we love the people that the world tells us that we're supposed to hate, Jesus promises that we'll be blessed richly. Luke chapter 6, verse 35, I love this. He says, but love your enemies, do good to them, lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then, listen to this, then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Now, I will tell you, you don't do this so you can put coin in your pocket. Because I don't think God's going to give you money because you forgive your enemies. But there will be blessing in your life. Blessing that we don't understand. Now listen, we're not going to get riches. We're not going to get dollars and cents. And very honestly, sometimes when we do this, we don't even get any accolades for it. But when we love our neighbor, when we extend to others the same mercy, listen to this, the same mercy that God extended to us, then we honor God. Because now we're walking in His footsteps the way we should. In Duncan Hamilton's biography, it's called For the Glory, we learned that the Scotsman, Eric Liddell, anybody know that name, Eric Liddell? How about if I say Chariots of Fire? Yeah, you remember that movie, Chariots of Fire? Well, this is Eric Liddell, the Chariots of Fire guy. His greatest challenge didn't come when he had to decide whether he was going to run in the Olympics on a Sunday during the 1924 Olympics. That's not when his character was tested. But his character was tested when he served as a missionary in China. It was during the Japanese occupation of China in the 30s and the 40s. And Eric Liddell was assigned to work at a rural mission outpost in this town in China. The name's about that long. He frequently came across dead bodies. He met men and women and children who were starved or they were injured because of these imperial Japanese troops, the brutal way that they treated the people. Now, Liddell himself was never injured by the Japanese, but they relentlessly hassled him and other missionaries in the course of their work. But eventually, Liddell sent his wife and his 3 daughters away from China to keep him safe. But as for himself, he remained in China. He believed that God called him there, and he was going to continue the work. He sent his family away, and he never saw them again. March of 1943, he was ordered by the Japanese officials to report to an internment camp called Weissenheim. There, in a space of about 3 football fields, were thousands of internees. And that's where he spent the last 2 years of his life. The man who had once delighted in running free across the fields and the seashore was now confined and restricted. Can we just say that was a miserable existence? They had very little to eat. The clothes that they wore became tatters while they were wearing them. They didn't have any kind of medical services. They had no idea when the guards were going to walk up to them and slap them or strike them in some way. I'm going to tell you, if ever anyone had a good reason to hate somebody else, it was him. He had cause to hate the Japanese. And yet, did he let anger, hatred burn in his heart? Did he plot revenge against the Japanese? No. Listen to what he did. He began to pray for them. He began to pray for them. The ones who were making it so difficult in his life, he was praying for. And so he started to urge his fellow internees to pray as well, to do what he was already doing. He said, I began to pray for the guards, and it's changed my whole attitude toward them. Here's this quote. When we hate, we are self-centered. Wow. When we hate, we're self-centered. Listen, what Liddell was doing is he was fulfilling the words of Jesus. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44. This is what he was doing. He was loving his enemies, and he was praying for those who persecute you. Here's the first thing I want us to grasp today, and that is the fact that we need to treat our enemies like our neighbors. We need to treat our enemies like our neighbors. Can I just say, loving our enemies is a very unnatural response to them. It's an unnatural choice. Because it makes perfect sense to you and I that if we're harmed by somebody or we see what's happening in Afghanistan, the natural response is to hate them. That's just who we are. But God does good to both the righteous and the wicked. And we are to be like God. We are to do good with the righteous and the wicked. I like Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 47. Jesus says this. He said, you've heard it said that love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to shine on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Enemies. Loving our enemies. Praying for their well-being. And probably even more important is we need to pray that God will give us the supernatural ability to love them as he does. It is very hard for me to comprehend this morning in this peanut of a brain that I got that he loves the Taliban. That is so hard for me to grasp, but yet he does. That's who Jesus died for. And yet it's so hard to grasp. We need to treat our enemies like our neighbors. The second thing we need to do and understand is that we can change relationships with forgiveness. We can change relationships with forgiveness. I want us to understand, listen, the injustices that we suffer here are real. Please, I understand that. They are real, and we should never take them lightly. But Jesus did tell a story that put them in perspective. And it started with a question by a guy named Peter. He wanted to know how many times he should forgive someone who offended him. I love this. When Eric Liddell, he preached on this passage, he pointed out that Peter and the other disciples had their whole perspective mixed up. It wasn't about putting limits on forgiveness, no matter how generous you thought you were being. It was about being utterly permeated with a spirit of forgiveness, as God is. So in this story, there's a servant that represents us, sinners. We owe an immense debt to the master, far more than we could ever pay back in a lifetime. And the master in this story represents God. And he forgives the debt. And yet instead of emulating that master's mercy, he goes out and he tries to shake down another servant who owes him just a little bit of money. Much smaller amount. Can we say he didn't learn the lesson of forgiveness? You see, the debts that we owe, the debts that we owe and the debts that are owed to us, folks, they're molehills. They're molehills compared to the debt that we owe to God. Think about that. We're all sinners. We were all sinners. That's when Christ came for us. Let me change the word. We were all enemies. We were enemies of God until Jesus came and made us friends with God. Colossians 3:13 says, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must forgive. Ouch. How much has God forgiven you from? Can I just throw up both hands and say more than I can count? I owe him everything. You owe him, if you're a believer this morning, you owe him everything. He set us free. And if we want to see ourselves set free from the hatred, then we need to start over in some of the relationships we have where we need to start forgiving people. Because you'll never be able to love your enemies until you can first forgive them. Think about this picture. Luke chapter 23, verses 34. This is Jesus. He said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Arms stretched out on a piece of wood. A hammer and railroad spikes going through his wrists. And as that's happening, he looks to his Father in heaven and says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Can I just say that's what we're experiencing right now in Afghanistan? They don't know what they're doing. Since the time of Isaac and Ishmael, that has been like that. Nothing has changed through the centuries of time. It's like that. It's crazy. And yet, Jesus forgave those who were nailing him to a cross. You know, and I look around this room this morning, I don't see any of you walking around with your arms spread out. Do I? I don't see any blood flowing. We've not yet suffered the way Jesus suffered for us. We were his enemy until he did that. He's not asking us to put our arms out on the cross. He's not asking us to put spikes in our wrists. What he's asking us is to forgive. To forgive. Think about what Jesus did. Forgiving those who were nailing him to the cross. Think about what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did when he forgave those Germans that put him in prison and killed him. Or how about Eric Liddell? Gave his enemies and started to pray for him. Folks, those are two human beings. Those last ones are two very normal human beings. You, me. And look what they did. And that tells me that you and I can do the same. We can do the same. But what we have to do and understand is we have to say no to revenge and yes to mercy. No to revenge. You know what? It's a whole lot more fun getting revenge, isn't it? Yes, no, maybe. Where you at? You here this morning? I know I'm sitting down, but you can still participate here. Isn't it a whole lot more fun getting revenge? You know, I used to have a saying. I still have the saying, and I use it sometimes. I don't get even, I get ahead. You ever done that? Think about it. They did this to me, but I'm going to go that far to them. You know, in the Old Testament, it was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the reason it was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is so you didn't go any further than that. So if somebody punched out an eye, you'd kill them. You weren't allowed to do that. You could only do to them what they did to you. So most of us grew up with the saying, you know, I don't get mad, I get even. I don't get mad, I get ahead. I'm going to make sure my revenge is good. That's how we think. That's how the American culture is teaching us to think. It's the world. Listen, when we've been unjustly mistreated, anybody ever been unjustly mistreated? Oh, did you not get a little bristly? Okay, if I'm the only one like that, I'm sorry, but yeah, I get a little bristly and I get a little indignation going. You do that? Listen, the preacher's up here confessing his sins today. You going to join me? I believe sitting here this morning, folks, that each and every one of us can personalize this sermon today. Today. Because I'm very sure that each and every one of us can place the face of someone in our minds that fit in the category of the enemy. So begin right now. That person does not have to be in your presence to forgive them. And that person does not need to be in your presence to love them. We begin loving our enemies today. Let me tell you, God is very clear on this. He tells us to leave the vengeance to him. I love this out of Romans chapter 12. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, live, or so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Most of you know that I worked at a children's home for several years, and we weren't there very long, and I was sitting talking with the executive director, Gary Porter, who recently passed away. Gary and I were sitting talking, and I was so frustrated because I could see what these kids had been through. The abuse and neglect that they had suffered, that they had endured, that we talked about in the houses with them. And I was getting so angry about that. I went to Gary and I said one time, Gary, here's what I want to do. When their parents come to visit, let's take them in the woods and do to them what they did to their kids. His response was classic. No, you just want to pray for a ringside seat to watch what God does to them. And then we went on talking, and he said, you realize that most of the people who've done that to the children have also had that done to them already. Whew. Let's say my frustration level decreased very quickly. I still didn't like it. I didn't like what had happened. But I could deal with it a lot better. If we weren't supposed to right the wrongs ourselves, if we're not supposed to go after vengeance, then what are we supposed to do? Continuing in Romans, God tells us, Romans 12, 20 and 21, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Have you ever heard the phrase, killing them with? You have heard it. Killing them with kindness. Yeah. And when you kill them with kindness, you're heaping the coals upon their heads of those who don't wish to be part of God's plan. We are supposed to actively do good to our enemies, to meet their needs. That's when we see the triumph of good over evil. Hey, today, right now, with that face that just popped up in your mind, what are you going to do today to serve them and to help them? Because that's what it's about. Listen, when someone treats us unjustly, we are to love them and not hate them. We're to forgive them and not seek revenge. And we are to do good to them instead of trying to punish them. In this way, we take on the character of Christ. In this way, we emulate our Father in heaven. Folks, there is no greater way to be a neighbor than to do to our neighbors as God did for us. You see, God looked down from heaven way back in Genesis. Back when that serpent took Eve aside and caused this doubt to come into her mind, and she and Adam sinned. Genesis 3:15 tells us that God put his plan into motion right then. But God looked down on this world and he saw you, he saw me, he saw his enemies. And what did he do when he saw us? What did he do? Come on, you can participate. What did he do? Jesus came, born in a manger, raised in a sinless life, preached, died on a cross, buried in a grave, and rose on the third day. That's what God did for his enemies. Us. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The challenge for today: love your enemies into a friendship.